what made you apply that to software?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I started the company in January of 2008. And I think I had just I'd worked in a lot of development shops that were internal IT who just sort of said no to everything. They either said no to, like, basically said no to their customers, right? The other
Right.
departments that relied on them. Um, and sort of gave up really easy, like, oh, that's too hard, and so I kind of wanted to be unstoppable, and it kind of was this mantra that, we're in the business of yes, like, and I mean, we really want to take our customers needs seriously, and uh, you know sort of solve those hard challenges that maybe other developers might give up on, and not necessarily that we are the best developers in the whole wide world, but I do think that when developers don't feel empowered to take risks or try things or experiment, then a lot of times they just, "Oh, I don't know how to solve it." I mean, if they're not allowed to innovate and experiment and so forth, then sometimes they can't solve something, right?
It,
Um,
yeah, it's an interesting craft, I'll call it, because there's an element of the people that go into it that if you're internal and you're in a political environment like you're describing, where you're not in an innovative role, you're just there to code. It's
mhm,
almost like you're a machine operator,
yeah,
right? And there's
yeah. I mean, it's a fancy form of typing, right?
obviously there's
And
more
it's
thought to it, but it's like if that's your limitations, like I code
yeah,
as opposed to I'm coming up with solutions, and I like that concept, which is like, hey, look, we're just gonna find a way to make this work well.
yeah. Like I had a customer once. They were a elevator manufacturer, and the project we were working on was a system that would help them design their machine rooms, which is like where all the pumps and motors and stuff live that operate the
Hmm.
elevators. And the developers working on that had not done a lot of work in sort of 3D um, collisions and like actually like laying things out on.
We are recording. This is another episode of the Automate and Grow podcast. My guest today is Sam Schutte, the CEO of Unstoppable Software. Sam is also the host of the Unstoppable Talk podcast. Sam, thanks for being my guest today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
No problem. Now, you are a CEO of a software company that is in a traditional Rust Belt. What is that like?
It can be a challenge sometimes to find talent. I think is probably the biggest thing. At the same time, there's a ample opportunity to help some of these companies that are, need a lot of help with digital transformation and other software development projects. Really help them kind of innovate. Um, so it kind of affects your business model a little bit and affects some of the customers you go after. I mean, we don't, necessarily go after a lot of high tech startups and stuff like that because they're not here, right?
Hmm.
So we tend to work with, companies making heavy machinery, industrial products and services, industrial engineering, chemical manufacturing. You know, um, so we've done a lot of work within that space because that's who's located here. And then I think on the talent side, it also means that rather than trying to just recruit around Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky, we recruit on a more nationwide basis and have a lot of folks working from home so that we can tap into those other talent pools and not be sort of limited here.
That makes sense. Do you see efforts to try and develop more like digital skilled people in your area, or is it kind of like an afterthought?
No, there's definitely a lot of there's all the digital or software development boot camps and that sort of stuff that you see a lot of, and certainly universities and such pushing that pretty hard, as well as a lot of surrounding businesses. But it's kind of a hard pitch, I guess. For a lot of folks that get a high tech degree, I mean, there's still a lot of attraction to moving to the coasts with that.
Right.
Um, and I mean, I think there's a lot of positives because it also, we can be a little bit more of a big fish in a small pond in the space that we're in. Companies working and doing the type of work we do, I think, there's not that many of us out there in our market. Um, but definitely, the talent issue is something that's always discussed.
It's interesting because you always see these memes and these hashtags around, learn to code, and they've kind of turned a little weird, but the intent is like, well, listen, this is a way to get out of the old world economy to a new world, but you're highlighting a funny coincidence that people don't think about, which is the upward mobility. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I got my skills, I can go to California.
Yeah, and it's funny because I graduated from University of Pittsburgh in August of 2000, so right before the dot com bubble popped,
Right.
right? And was sitting around at home, and my mom was like, you probably should get a job or something. It's you've been graduated now for 3 weeks, haven't done anything. And so I put my resume out at 9 a.m. and by 2 p.m. I had a job.
Oh my
And I
god.
was like, "Mom, I got a job." She's like, "What do you mean?" Like, and I was like, "I got a job today." She's like, "Today?" Like
Wow,
it
isn't
took
that
eight
crazy?
6 hours, and I mean it was well paying, it was like 55,000 a year or something like that right out of college, right? Which is not bad, and
Yeah.
that's so totally changed now because a lot of the sort of young folks coming out of college, I hear, even with degrees, they might have to do unpaid internships and all this weird, like, I mean, a post college unpaid internship. I mean, isn't that just slavery? I'm not sure what that is,
I
or
think a
indentured
lot of people are
servitude or
getting away
something.
from that, but I mean, it is valuable. They do get credit, and I've had
Yeah,
interns, and they've been, they're a little raw, right? But
yeah.
they try to make up for it in enthusiasm. It's like getting production out of that is a little tricky, right?
Well,
Because
and I think,
it's like, oh, you just spent 4 years. What the hell did you learn?
yeah. Well, but it's kind of like you got student loans to pay back. It's hard
Well,
to
that
it's hard
too.
to do that. So I think it's a harder market now because that market, the hiring or ability for companies to hire junior talent and sort of new talent is probably tighter than it used to be. Um,
And we do
at
have
least
a
my
lot of
understanding.
access to global resources, right? So you can get
Sure.
really good coders, probably better coders, like if you're looking for technical talent in other countries for similar money.
Yeah. Well, and
That's
I think it's
a junior
you
person.
know you're right, and I mean, I think it's like a friend of mine, their son wants to get into software development, doesn't have a degree in it, but wants to get into it and figure out a way. And it's like, it's not just learning to code, right? You have to learn
Right.
a lot of soft skills, because it's become such a uh, sort of high communication, interpersonal skills, documentation, design type job, right?
Mhm. You just
That
hit the D word, which is design, right? Like, it's
yeah,
not a joke. It's
yeah,
like, not to say that coding is a joke,
sure,
but
sure.
I think that you just hit it on the head, which is building digital products is more than, just hiring a coder, right?
Yeah. Well, I always say, the key to good software is communication, right? I mean, good code is important,
Mhm.
but you can have good products that doesn't have the best, prettiest code in the world, right? But I think it's far easy to have bad products that have wonderful code, right? I mean, that's
There's a lot of or that never get released.
yeah,
The
and and
code is
and
always the god, and you're trying to make it better and better.
yeah, I mean, you gotta serve both masters, I suppose,
Makes sense.
but you know, uh, sitting down with people and really trying to extract information and requirements. I mean, that's kind of what I do in my role with the company is sort of, I'm the architect, business analyst. I do a lot of that sort of stuff. I kind of straddle that fence a lot because after I got my computer science degree, I got my MBA about 10 years later. And so I can kind of straddle that fence between business and technical. Um, and then communicate that to the developers and stuff working for me. So um, I think that's often where projects fail is that they don't have that good communication.
That makes a lot of sense, which is, like, understand the business problem and then bridge the gap between how you want it to work and the guys that gotta make it work, which is usually more than one person. It's like, you've got the designer, you've got the architect, which you're doing that role, PMs, like all the stuff to make
Mhm.
the product. And I find it interesting. So where did the name Unstoppable come from? Like, what made you apply that to software?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I started the company in January of 2008. And I think I had just I'd worked in a lot of development shops that were internal IT who just sort of said no to everything. They either said no to, like, basically said no to their customers, right? The other
Right.
departments that relied on them. Um, and sort of gave up really easy, like oh, that's too hard, and so I kind of wanted to be unstoppable, and it kind of was this mantra that we're in the business of yes, like we and I mean we really want to take our customers' needs seriously, and uh, you know sort of solve those hard challenges that maybe other developers might give up on, and not necessarily that we have the best developers in the whole wide world, but I do think that when developers don't feel empowered to take risks or try things or experiment, then a lot of times they just I don't know how to solve it. I mean, if they're not allowed to innovate and experiment and so forth, then sometimes they can't solve something, right?
It,
Um,
yeah, it's an interesting craft, I'll call it, because there's an element of the people that go into it that if you're internal and you're in a political environment like you're describing, where you're not in an innovative role, you're just there to code. It's
mhm,
almost like you're a machine operator,
yeah,
right? And there's
yeah. I mean, it's a fancy form of typing, right?
obviously there's
And
more
it's
thought to it, but it's like if that's your limitations, like I code
yeah,
as opposed to I'm coming up with solutions, and I like that concept, which is like, hey, look, we're just gonna find a way to make this work well.
yeah. Like I had a customer once. They were a elevator manufacturer, and the project we were working on was a system that would help them design their machine rooms, which is like where all the pumps and motors and stuff live for that operate the
Hmm.
elevators. And the developers working on that had not done a lot of work in sort of 3D um, collisions and like actually like laying things out on the screen in a way, because like you need, when you place a motor in the room, it needs to like hit up against the wall and not be able to like drag over the wall, right? And so I said, well, we need to figure out something that allows them to figure out how to do this kind of collision detection in this particular platform we were using, right? So I said, go make Tetris, you know,
Yeah,
and
Tetris.
I go to the customer and we're like, well, first phase we're gonna do is we're gonna make Tetris, and they're like, we're gonna what? What are we
Yeah,
paying you to do, right? And we had to justify it, but they were innovative enough of the customer and the client, believed in the project, that it's like, oh, I get it. Yeah, because if you can make the game Tetris where things bounce off the walls, well, that's the same thing that we got to do with, this machine or this motor or whatever it was. Um, and my point is to your, I guess what you were saying is like, if you're in like an intensely political environment where a developer is just like, uh, you know, somebody in the back room you don't talk to. I mean, he get, they'd be laughed out of the building if he said, "I have this experiment. I want to build Tetris." Right. Um, so,
right.
you got to foster an environment of experimentation. Sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I have like almost fear that in 50 years there's coding unions.
Yeah, and I think I've heard a little bit about that even in
Oh, really? Oh my
yeah,
god.
there was some company, one of the big ones, I think, that they were talking about the developers unionizing. And but I
It
mean,
doesn't surprise me just based upon like the I think it's a very North American thing, whereas I think coders in other places that I meet are very entrepreneurial.
hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because usually when uh, I think if you look at most unions for other trades or just trades in general, and it could be teachers or pilots unions, whatever.
Right?
I can't think of too many unions that don't require extensive certification. I, mean,
That's
I might be
I feel like
wrong.
there's less now, right? For
But I mean,
coders,
if you're,
like
but
for
if
coders,
well, yeah, exactly, because in our space, there are no certifications required, and any certifications that there are just dependent on what some company wanted to make money on or
correct.
sell,
That
right?
makes sense.
If you look at, way back when during the .com bubble and stuff, if you went and got your Cisco certification, let's
Right?
say,
CNA or whatever it was.
yeah,
I
exactly.
did
So,
that.
because I had people when I was like a sophomore in college, I ran into this one guy once, and he said, you should drop out of school, get your CCIE or whatever it was,
Right?
CNA or something, and I'll give you 80 grand a year. Like as soon as you get that certification, you won't need a
Sure.
degree, right? And it's tempting, or it was tempting, and um, but I think, and there's still, I mean, I think certifications still have merit, but some of those have gotten pretty watered down where, the answers are online. There's the whole brain dump thing that you could go buy the results and
Mhm.
studying and stuff. it doesn't necessarily, at least this is just my personal belief. I'm not a huge believer in some of these sort of privately owned certifications, but you know, but it makes you wonder if you did say, hey, if you want to be a developer, you got to join this developer union. Would it improve the
I don't
quality of
no.
developers?
Oh, absolutely no, it'd make it way worse. Like,
Yeah.
I think the reality of what we're saying is, right now, you can prove that you're a coder by your portfolio, and
Hmm.
someone can inspect what you're doing and tell whether you know what you're doing, and the certifications, I think, are being independent are actually good because there's 0 to me in a 4-year degree that, like, it should not take you 4 years to be able to make software.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean,
Like, you could do in 4 years,
yeah,
what? How many projects? 12?
there were probably, two classes or maybe three classes out of how many uh, in my undergrad that really made me or gave me anything that I used,
Yeah.
in the after school. So most of it is just like fluff, right?
I
Um,
think a lot. I think this is a space where it's proof is to me is like most trades, it's hands-on is way more effective.
you know,
Judge, but and if I think if people are focused on being a freelancer and building a portfolio, that is more important than the stamps that they put. And I would hope that that's kind of continuing. I don't know. I think it's Wild West, obviously. So there's absolutely no there's no universal, well, this is what makes a good coder and this is
mhm.
how I judge you. And I think the more that we get into like that structured, well, do you have a degree? Do you have these certifications? To your point, like you can just get the answers as opposed to let's look at the body of your work and how you think.
Well, and I think that's a good point. I mean, that is what I look at when I hire folks. Is I'm like, okay, what have they done? Where have they been? And if they spent I mean, I don't know. I don't want to throw any specific examples, I guess, but if it seems like they just have not really done anything major or cool, or the way they describe it, they can't, it's too hand wavy. That's what I kind of look at, right? And then I'll ask, like, so you were involved in Project X. What did you build? And if they say, well, I built the database layer and the part that talked to it, and blah blah blah, and they can talk about like what technologies they used and how it worked and what were the pitfalls and the problems and the challenges and all this of that, and it's like, all right, this he obviously understands what he's talking about. Um, but
Right.
uh,
Which is what I'm saying with this exact same thing. It's like,
yep,
can this person think and communicate to
yeah,
the
because that's
extent that I expect them, right? Like,
yeah, because that is, I mean, like you said, that's what really matters is your experience in your portfolio and your background, right, and not just what certifications you have or even what degree you have. I mean, my actually probably the smartest guy I ever worked for when before I started my company, when I was working as a software developer, was this guy named Mike, and he literally wrote the book on C++, right? Like he
wow.
wrote a book, Microsoft Press,
Damn.
developing in Microsoft Visual C++ or whatever it was at the time, right? And he had a what was it, oceanography degree or something, or
Okay.
marine biology. It was something like that. That was his degree, you know.
Thing
And
didn't
so
matter.
clearly, it didn't. He didn't have to have a computer science degree if Microsoft felt that he was good enough to write the book on C++, right?
Right. Yeah.
So
No, that's I mean, I think that totally makes sense. And I think it would be a terrible turn if everything became about stamps because then it makes it much more difficult to sift through and figure out.
sure,
And plus the mentality I think would damage, it would be the opposite of unstoppable, I believe.
yeah.
It is, and I think that that's why I brought it up, which is I think that is a risk based upon the personality of people that may be drawn to code sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of interesting too if you look at like, well, how do our clients hire us,
Mhm.
right? Do they, because they could just give us a quiz for us to answer as a company. Do you have in house the following skills? Did,
Right.
did, 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 did. And how do you prove that you do or don't? I mean, you imagine if I'm representing a group of people that aren't on this sales call, let's say this theoretical sales call. And I mean, if I check every box, I mean, what does that mean? Because we can still be really hard to work with, or too
Right.
expensive, or sloppy, or unethical, right? Um, and I think that the customers that work with us, I mean, the questions they ask and what I really tell them is like, we want to be your strategic partner, to help you develop your software development strategy. So I mean, this is a business strategy. This is not hiring. Like, no, companies would usually not say that whoever they hire to clean their bathrooms is a business strategy, right?
Right.
But to your point earlier, some people think that's sort of just like programmers are just some necessity. It's like, yeah, just whoever, like, it just
Here's
has
the
to be
people.
done. But if we, identify and develop the right approach and the right engagement with a customer, then it can really, amplify their ability to hit their business goals, right? And so that's why people hire us, and not just, hey, can you check this box of a certain skill set? And I think that's like, if you're selling that way as a consulting company, you're way down the basement somewhere. You're not, you know what I mean? You're not hitting high level enough.
That makes sense. You're not talking the strategy and then connecting it to the actual product that you build eventually.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. And I know we focused a lot on coders, but there are those other things you need, right? Like you need good UI and UX means you need a designer, right? You need a
Hmm.
business person to figure out here's the real problem and here's how I would solve it using technology.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, and I think those are some of those soft skills. And then that's always a challenge of how do you cross over from, like, if you look at UI and UX stuff, and I mean, I'm not going to claim that I'm a UX expert per se. That's not my particular, me individually, my expertise. I have some UX guys that know it better than me. But I think that it's always a challenge to define what level of user interface, design and quality is necessary, right, or desired by the customer. Because customers will say, I was talking to somebody last week about this. They'll say, I just want it to pop, I just want it to sizzle or something, right? And this is like an old trope of design, of graphic designers, like, oh, okay. And I was joking around with this person about it because it is just, but I get it, because how else do you describe it? Like, because if I say on a level of 1 to 10, how good does this user interface need to be? Pretty much everybody's going to say 10,
Right.
right? But if I say, okay, that's $5 million, because
It's the greatest interface ever made by
it's it's like, I mean, what did Apple spend on Apple CarPlay? Which is, I mean, I'm not going to say it's the best interface ever, but clearly they had a UX person working on it,
must,
right?
yeah, for sure.
You
Or
know,
they had a team. I mean, they probably
yeah,
had hundreds of
a
people.
team of, yeah, a huge team, and I mean, spent. I would not be surprised if at all if you said just the user interface of it was $5 million, right?
Oh, probably
I mean, I
more.
don't think that's crazy at all to imagine.
Not
And so, but is that what a data input output application to record like service tickets for a janitorial services company? Is that what they need?
probably.
No, right?
Yeah. They
So
need to
where's
be
that?
functional and
Yeah, and so I mean, I think the only way you can really solve that is by doing the work, doing your homework. Like, I mean, there's always strategies you can put in place. Like, okay, Mr. Customer, you said that you want a good looking user interface. Can you show me what that means to you? Show me 4 or 5 competing applications, your competitors in the market that you want, what you like about them. I mean, print them out, get a pen and draw on the piece of paper. I don't like the color of this. I don't like this font. I like this. I like that. Um, because it's always better to sort of borrow ideas, than it is to sort of create new ones, maybe, or always easier rather,
you're
maybe
not borrowing
better.
bad ones.
Pardon?
As long as you're not borrowing bad
Well,
ones.
yeah, and that's true. But and then maybe go ahead and build a first pass at that, and because you can't just necessarily write down ahead of time like this user interface is going to be of high quality. It doesn't mean anything to anybody,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's kind of like, again, I mean, it's that communication. How do you sort of strategically go through a process to get people information in front of them, through mock-ups or planning or feedback or review. And usually the thing is, for 99% or 95%, let's say, of development teams, that never happens, right? It's just, you're going to love it. Promise, trust me. And then you get it back in
Like,
six
what is
months
this?
and you're like, I've never seen this before, and it's done. Yep, it's done. It's like, well, hang on, you know, and I mean, not everybody does that, but I do run into folks that still try to work that way, you know. Um, so yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Well, I want to be conscious of your time. A couple of things. One is who are the 5 people that you spend the most time with?
That's a good question. So I mean, I have a wife and 3 kids, so that's certainly 4
There's
of them
4.
right there. Um,
There's 4. You get room
uh,
for, like, 1 more person in your life, it sounds like.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Probably my assistant or someone who's in the office every day, I suppose, uh, or something like that. Maybe my parents from time to time. I'm also in the Rotary Club in Cincinnati, and so I spend
Okay.
a good amount of time. I mean, it's not just 5 per se, but certainly with a lot of the entrepreneurs and executives that are in that club. See all those folks every week, and I'm always able to bounce ideas off of them and stuff. So there's a lot of good networking I'm able to do because of that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, masterminding, so to speak, is always really important, and
Yeah.
it helps. That's a great organization. I haven't actually been part of that, but
Hmm.
I know
Just
people that
check it
have.
out.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
might actually have to check that
Yeah.
out.
There's over 1.2 million members. So,
Is it really? Oh, wow.
yep. Yeah.
I'm picturing always from Happy Days people with the grand poobah hat, but that's
Yeah. Yeah.
the water buffalo. That I'm dating myself by people probably have never seen Happy Days that listen to
I
this.
have.
Okay, good. I feel better. But um, okay, so before we wrap with a couple things, one is what's the best way for people to get in touch with you, and make sure we include your podcast, the Unstoppable Talk podcast.
Yeah. So our website is unstoppablesoftware.com. And if you go there, you can see a link to the podcast, or you can also go to unstoppabletalk.com. To reach me, probably the easiest way, cell phone number is 513-382-8499. Or you can always email me at schutte, that's SSCHUTTE, at unstoppablesoftware.com.
Love it. That's easy. You're the
Yep.
second person that's given out their phone number. The one we have a podcast we're releasing. There's a pretty high profile person who's like, text me, just text me.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, it's
So
some of
funny.
my biggest opportunities recently I've gotten through text. It's just so much easier, right?
That's
Um,
very true. I have
yeah.
to start doing that. Maybe I need a phantom number in front of my other one.
I mean, my cell phone is out there all over the internet anyway. So, I mean,
That's probably
it's not,
true.
you know.
All right. So, Sam, how are you changing the world?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess by creating a software development environment that developers thrive in a way that it benefits our customers, and helps them really amplify what they're able to do. Um, so I think, as a small team, we've been able to do some incredible projects for multi-billion-dollar companies that have really big impacts, and that kind of amplifies our effect out there. Um, you know, touch a lot of different people, and improve uh, the quality of their job and how they're able to work.
That's amazing. And that's very important.
Yeah.
So the final thing is when we have interesting people on the Automate and Grow podcast, we'd like you to nominate somebody that you know that you think would also be an interesting guest on a future episode of Automate and Grow. We typically talk to experts or entrepreneurs. So who would you, Sam, like to nominate as a future guest?
So there's a very interesting gentleman here in town. His name is Brian Burke, who is the chief Mac man at SellYourMac.com. And he is running quite an interesting business that's growing quite rapidly in the secondhand market for Apple equipment. So I would nominate him.
Brian Burke, not to be confused with the Brian Burke that coached at Mercyhurst in hockey and was the general manager, which is another Brian Burke of the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Calgary
Probably
Flames
not. Yeah, I don't think it's the same
and the Vancouver Canucks. Yeah, we'll get him on another show maybe.
guy.
Okay, so Brian Burke from sellyourmac.com, you've been
Yeah,
nominated as a future guest. Sam, I want to thank you for your time today.
yeah, absolutely. Pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise, this has been another episode of the Automate and Grow podcast. We will see you on a future episode of Automate and Grow.